Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lassiter here with you again, and it's been a little while, I feel like, but we are here and ready to review for our AP exam. I don't know if you can believe it, but we are getting closer and closer to the AP exam date. In fact, I think we are. If I look it up here, 16 days, 10 hours, and 57 minutes here on the East Coast from the AP exam. That's not to worry you, because we're here to help here at Fiveable. Hopefully you've been tuning in. There are a lot of really great reviews coming out. I don't know if you've been watching them. A lot of really awesome teachers been reviewing some skills recently. And we'll be having more and more of those over the coming weeks. Of course, as always, I'll be with you. Amanda will be with you. Dylan will be coming in for some special reviews. So we hope that that will be something that can help prepare you for the AP exam. There's a poll down there about, are you a Fiveable Plus member? So that's something that you may want to consider as we do these reviews. It gives you access to our complete library from the year. And maybe that's something that you're interested in to help you move for the AP exam. There is, at the bottom of your screen, you will see an Ask a Question tab. And already there's some really good questions being asked. We're focusing today in this review on time periods 3 and 4. We're going to primarily talk about trade. That is kind of a theme that runs through both of these time periods that I think is really important. So there was a lot of stuff I could pick for units 3 and 4. And it's a big topic to cover, right? Thinking about covering 40% of the course in an hour or an hour 15 or whatever we'll run. So I decided, I was thinking, well, what is it that really defines both of these time periods that we might see comparisons about in each time period? And the thing that really jumps to my mind is trade. And it's something I love talking about. And there are certainly more things than trade you might have questions about. So feel free to populate down below. We'll certainly have time for questions for you today. So I'm going to change the focus of my screen. I'm going to make myself very tiny. Hopefully I won't be in the way of some of this stuff today. Though I'm feeling like I might be in the way of a couple things that'll be on there. So you have to listen to what I have to say. And let's get started. Again, you can follow Fiveable at Think Fiveable, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I'm Mr. Lassiter. You can follow me, ask questions if you got them on Twitter or on my YouTube channel, where I have some key concept reviews that will also help. But this is a review of trade in time periods 3 and 4. So I'll talk about how we're going to do that. Oh God, I need to close this chat. People are comparing me to John Green, and I am not worthy of being compared. Maybe it's because I haven't shaved and I look like I've been teaching an entire day, because that's what's happened. Anyways, so let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to be comparing trade in periods 3 and 4. Here's the first thing. Everything that we do today is designed to help you complete perhaps like a larger, like I want you to leave today with a product, something that you can use to study. And I am not going to be covering everything exhaustively. Some of the things that are in this, there's a little bit more to it. But I tried to go through the key concepts and pull what I thought was some relevant stuff today in this comparison. So if you navigate to that tiny URL, you can just type it in your document. It will ask you, it'll bring up a Google Doc and it'll say, make a copy. And, it's a Google Doc. So you make a copy of that and then you can just type right in there. And so you have a chart that will come up that will have time periods 3 and 4 and ask you to compare trade. And it'll have a whole bunch of categories, which we'll be going through today. So I'll leave this this tiny URL up for a little bit. I'm also going to throw it in the chat right now, so you can copy and paste it in if that makes it a little bit easier for you. But everything we're going to do is designed to fill in this chart. I see some people in the chat asking about making these slides available. They are available in the Fiveable library. I think they're available to Fiveable Plus members. If you are not a Fiveable Plus member, then get those fingers typing, get on this chart, work along with us, put me over in kind of the side on one window and put that chart up on the second. Otherwise, you can draw it out by hand yourself. So let's go ahead and get started today. So we're comparing time period, trade in time period 3 and trade in time period 4. And the first thing we're going to go through is just time period 3 with a quick recap of what trade looked like in this time period, focusing primarily on the causes and effects of trade in both of these. So let's get started and think about how we can describe trade in period 3. And it is best described as trans-regional. That means each of these kind of individual regions that we've been studying about in our course, whether it be China and East Asia or the Middle East or Africa, those are different kind of regions of our world, right? And we're seeing trade go between these regions. So transferring between regions, trans-regional. Also, Amanda just sent me a message. She said, just go ahead and share the slides in the chat. I will do that at the end of today. So if you hang on to the end, put the link to the slides in the chat. Let's take a look here at other ways we describe this. So trans-regional, keep that in mind because period 4 trade, we're going to describe as global as opposed to trans-regional. Now, in this time period, it is the Indian Ocean Network, which is king. That's why I've chosen the image here of the Indian Ocean Network. But there are several other dominant trade networks. The Silk Roads reach their height in this time period. The Trans-Saharan Network grows to its height in this time period. The Mediterranean Maritime Network, which had existed in our previous time period, continuing this. All of these networks continue from period 2. They all exist in period 2, but they really take off in this time period. They, as the key concepts say, they intensify in this time period. So just kind of keep that in mind. And even though even though trade is growing in these networks, the Indian Ocean Network is going to carry the highest volume of trade. So that's what we're referring to. A question in the chat I see, trans-regional just across regions. Yes, exactly. So that's how we best describe it. Now, who are the major participants in this? Well, it really depends on what network we're talking about, right? In the Indian Ocean, you see, for example, like the Swahili coast of East Africa, even the Middle East, places like Yemen, Oman, South Asia, the trading states of India, Southeast Asia, the Malay peoples, China even gets involved in this trade in this time period. At the very end, we have to think about Zhonghe in this network. The Indian Ocean, though, is not going to be participated by. Not everyone's going to participate in it. For example, Europeans aren't participating in the Indian Ocean Trade Network in this time period. The Mongols don't really participate in this trade. You know, all these people who are kind of Eurasian land folk, they're not participating. The Silk Roads, you're going to have China on one end. Depending on the time period, you know, you have the Byzantines on the western edge and the Islamic caliphates on the western edge. Eventually, the Silk Roads are united together by the Mongols. So throughout this time period, remember, it's 600 to 1450. That's time period 3. You may want to add that in your chart, actually, in the heading for the chart, what your time periods are. That's something that I just completely forgot to put in this presentation, so might be worth noting. But that's, you know, it's a big period of time. We're talking about 850 years here. So depending on the different times in this, along these trade networks, different people will be involved. In the trans-Saharan network, around the year 600, when the growth of Islam, as it spreads across North Africa, we're going to see that trans-Saharan network trade start to pick up quite a bit. They're going to trade with sub-Saharan African empires, like the Mali Empire, for example, a trade of things like salt from Northern Africa to Southern Africa in exchange for gold, ivory, slaves. So these are some things to consider. The Mediterranean, lots of different groups. The Romans in time period 2. It's by the time you get time period 3, it's the Byzantines, and then later it's Arab merchant traders, and then late in this time period you have the Venetian merchants who come to dominate a lot of trade in the Mediterranean. So lots of different participants across lots of different trade networks. Keep that in mind. We'll compare that to period 4 in a little bit. So what is it that caused trade on this in time period 3? What are the causes of the intensification of this trade? Why are people even trading at all along these networks? Well, period 2 saw a greater interaction of cultures, even when the Silk Roads were developing between China and even Europe, thinking about the Roman Empire on one end, China on the other, the Mauryan and Gupta empires in the middle, the Persian empires in the middle. Cultures start to interact more and more. They begin to like the other stuff these cultures create. There's a higher demand for luxury items. For example, silk from China becomes like the major item traded along, the Silk Roads, but which I guess makes sense. But other luxury items, whether it be tea or coffee or porcelain that are traded in the Indian Ocean, those become quite significant as well. Along with that, in pretty much every case, anytime we see an expansion of trade, it's usually partially due to new trading technologies. In the Indian Ocean, one of the reasons why they become this network becomes dominant is because of larger ships. For example, Chinese junk ships, which are used for trade in the Indian Ocean. They can carry much larger goods. The invention and the improvements upon the compass and the astrolabe, they're used in the Indian Ocean before Europeans used them to sail across the Atlantic. So these new technologies make trade and travel much easier. On the Silk Roads and in the Trans-Saharan network, that looked like camel saddles, or the development of caravanserai, which were these kind of like camel motels, right? These rest areas where people could trade and do business, and then rest for a set number of days, pay a fee, and then continue on their caravan with what could be dozens to hundreds of camels in tow, laden with luxury goods. But there are other reasons why trade expands in this time period. For example, we see the development of banks. We see the development of paper money, especially among the Chinese, and that spreads along our trade networks. We see trading organizations. One thing that I don't really highlight here is the North is traded even in Northern Europe, and the Hanseatic League comes into being, where Northern European cities work together to support trade between them. Cities in England and Denmark and Scandinavia and Russia, they all kind of join in and protect trade between all of these cities because it's in their best interest. So we see states start to support trade in this era, even more so than in the last era. One way in which they continue to support trade is by building infrastructure, roads, canals. That leads simply to more trade. And the last thing we see, of course, is the expansion of empires. Just like in time period 2, where we see the expansion of empires and that be accompanied with greater trade, like trade along the Silk Road, we'll see the same thing in this time period. The growth of the Islamic caliphates will lead to greater trade across the Dar al-Islam. It'll lead to greater trade in the Indian Ocean, with Europe and the Mediterranean, and along the Silk Roads. The growth of the Tang dynasty of China will help with that. Then later on, the Mongols will also facilitate trade. When you have large empires who are quite powerful and can protect traders and merchants along trade routes, people are more likely to take the risk and do so, and thus it'll pay off. So those are some things that we see. When empires weaken, of course, trade tends to weaken as well. So those are some causes of trade. I'm gonna leave this up for just a second for you to get caught up if you need in the on your charts that you're creating. So I'll take a peek at the questions that we have, and I'll answer one of those while you get caught up. So the first question has 11 upvotes coming from Kieran. How did the Mongols affect the trade routes during time period 3? So I was just sort of answering that question. So it's really cool. This is a kind of a top question that you already have. The Mongols developed several policies to support trade. One, for example, they issued passports to merchants who paid their taxes to the state, and thus those merchants were then protected by the Mongols themselves. And so that gave them kind of free passage from one end of the empire to the other. Imagine going from Baghdad, one of the most prominent cities in the world at the time, all the way to Beijing in China. And the entire way you were under one government's control, right? That was the world of the Mongols, and it made trade much easier. One way to think about this is trade across the United States, right? You have these interstate systems. The government of the United States builds these roads to allow these 18-wheelers to go from New York to Los Angeles or wherever they need to go very easily. Now, imagine if you had a lot of, let's say the states of the US were separate countries. And when you left New York and you drove into New Jersey, you had to pay a special tax or custom fee to New Jersey. And then when you left New Jersey and got into Pennsylvania, you had to pay another one, right? That would slow trade down, make it much more expensive, perhaps even make trade from a place like New York, California, over land anyways, almost pointless, right? It would just become way too expensive, maybe not even worth the risk. Let's say you had to go through, I'll pick a random state, Missouri, and Missouri was lawless, and so bandits reigned in Missouri, right? And you wouldn't want to trade across the country. The Mongols, on the other hand, they had control end to end of the Silk Roads, and so they really affect trade in that region. Now, beyond the Silk Roads, the Mongols don't really extend their power into the Indian Ocean. They don't extend it into the Mediterranean. So they don't expand it to the Trans-Saharan network. So those trade networks still basically continue on. But the Silk Road really reaches its height under the Mongols because of some of their policies regarding trade and their support for trade across their empire. Really good question. All right, so we're going to continue here with thinking about trade in time period 3. So let's think about, first of all, just the effects of trade in a nutshell. I just tried to I thought about what are some things that stand out to me in time period 3 that set it apart for me from time period 4, right? 600 to 1450 here. One thing that we see is that trade intensifies in this time period, meaning more people are trading and they're trading more goods. And they're trading goods to more places, right? We're seeing the expansion of trade. Trade is something that has always defined humanity, and it's a theme of history. It's constantly expanding more and more and more and more. And that's what we see from 600 to 1450, starting with the rise of Islam and going all the way till after the Mongols are in charge, all the way to when Europeans start to explore. It's continued to expand. More stuff traded to more places. However, remember, it is not yet global. We're thinking primarily in this video about Afro-Eurasian trade. There certainly was trade in the Americas. It was not as widespread as what we see in Afro-Eurasia. It was much more regional than trans-regional in the Americas. But there was trading in the Americas as well. But there is not trading between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia at this point. And then I just this was a joke when I wrote it down. And it was funny. Now I don't know if it makes sense. Europeans, right? Oh, you mean the Franks. So Europeans were not a dominant force yet in trade in time period 3. Outside of perhaps the Mediterranean, and outside of maybe northern Eurasian land-based trade. Europeans are, they're off out there. They're in the boonies. They're separated from the rest of Asia. The hot spots for trade were across the Silk Roads. They were in the Middle East, in India, in Southeast Asia, in China. Europe, not so much. I think it's in the Crusades when Europeans arrive in the Middle East, the Muslim Arab armies there just refer to them all as Franks, or the Frange, as they called them, because they just all, the first group that came spoke French. Everybody else who came looked like the French. And so they were all Franks. They didn't really care too much about them. They weren't differentiating between different Europeans, but they also didn't have to deal with them so much in day-to-day trade. So I guess the point of that is Europe is not the dominant force in trade in time period 3. So let's go beyond this and let's think a little bit more deeply about the effects of period 3's trade in the Indian Ocean, in the Trans-Saharan Network, Mediterranean, in Afro-Eurasia, along the Silk Roads. And we're going to start with some environmental effects of this trade. Okay, so I'm going to also, at this point, I see some people have joined us a little bit late in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and put the link to the chart we are working on in the chat. tinyurl.com/Fiveable April 29 review. That'll make a copy of a Google Doc for you that you can follow along with. I'll also put these slides up at the end today. So period 3, effects of trade. Let's first think about environmental effects. One thing that we see in time period 3 is that through trade, lots of things spread, right? We know goods spread. I'm kind of supposing we understand that in this lesson. I'm not so much going into what was traded where in terms of goods. I'm focusing on some other things. So I'm sorry about that, but I figure I'd hit the things that we might not already know. But environmental effects, one thing that we see is, of course, a diffusion of crops. This makes sense. We know that you're likely know about the diffusion of crops of the Columbian exchange, but it also is happening in time period 3. For example, the spread of bananas to Africa and the proliferation of bananas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. The spread of rice in East Asia, especially new varieties of rice like champa rice, which spreads from the regions of Vietnam northward into China during the Tang Dynasty. Even cotton begins to spread out of India and into places like Iran and into the Middle East. Sugar spreads, citrus fruits. So these crops start spreading along with this trade. And so that's something that's kind of interesting to think about if we're going to be comparing time period 3 with time period 4, right? We see the spread of these plants, these foodstuffs in both time periods. Along with trade, we see other environmental factors, right? As people trade and trade routes are developed, people migrate along those routes. There are 2 big kind of migrations in this time period. The Bantu migrations, which spread iron working in farming in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, changed the landscape of sub-Saharan Africa, and the Polynesian migrations in Southeast Asia into the Pacific, which spread agriculture, spread different animal groups. And the Bantu migrations, the Polynesian migrations, they are included in time period 3's key concepts. But I do want to emphasize that those migrations are over thousands of years across many different time periods. So time period 2, 3, maybe even some case really kind of stretch back even as far back as time period 1 in some cases, but we deal with them here in time period 3. So that's why I'm including them here. And then another environmental effect, remember when goods are traded, food can be traded, but another biological thing that's traded, disease. So disease spreads in this time period. The most significant spread of disease in this time period is from Asia to Europe along the Silk Roads, and that is the bubonic plague, the Black Death, right? So that is another, and these are some of those environmental effects of trade. But what might be even more significant than these environmental effects of trade are the cultural effects. And so I want to think about cross-cultural exchange now. I have 3 slides on this, so you have a lot of information. I've separated it out in your chart with religion and technology, science, and then I think I have like an area for other exchanges. So hopefully that's helpful for you. I don't know if it will be, but hopefully it will be. So just kind of take a look at those. All right. Let's see if I can pull this up now. Yeah, so we're just going to deal, all of these are under cross-cultural actually in your chart, so you can separate them however you see fit. The first one I want to talk about are the cross-cultural exchange. In time period 3, the most important of these is religion. And you see this excellent map, Freemanpedia. Man, what a map maker. What a cartographer that guy is. So the spread of religion really comes to define time period 3. And it is it spreads along these trade routes. Most significant is the spread of Islam. And I could do, maybe I should do a whole video just on the rise of Islam for this, but Islam spreads throughout Afro-Eurasia after beginning in the Arabian Peninsula, and it spreads along the conquest routes, but it also spreads along the Silk Road. It spreads on the Indian Ocean maritime system. It spreads in the Trans-Saharan network. It spreads through the Mediterranean. If I haven't already said that one, it spreads through the Arabian trade networks. So Islam is going to spread across our regions. It begins in the Arabian Peninsula. By the end of this time period, Islam is found everywhere from South and Southeast Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa to Spain. Now, in addition to that, we have other religions continuing to spread in this time period. Christianity began in time period 2. It will continue to spread in time period 3. I think one of the most interesting facts is that to think about is that Islam had conquered Spain before Christianity reached Denmark, right, in Europe. So that think about the speed at which Islam moves, that the Islamic Caliphates basically conquer everything from India to Spain, and Christianity hasn't even taken hold all across Europe, which, when we think of Europe as kind of the home for a large, the majority of Christians. So Christianity continues to spread mostly along Eurasian trade networks, especially networks in Europe. In Asia, we see the continued spread of Buddhism and Hinduism. We also see from China to Southeast Asia to Korea and Japan, the spread of Neo-Confucianism, which it's tough to call that a religion, but it's certainly a kind of a cultural marker that spreads, right? It is a philosophy that spreads along trade networks, particularly those between China and its neighbors. Beyond religion, right? Other cross-cultural exchanges, the spread of technology and science. And this spread of technology, I do want to highlight here that it's kind of setting up the trade that occurs in time period 4, right? So we're going to see the continued spread of technologies. Some of the more important technologies that spread: paper and printing, gunpowder spreads. I don't have that on this list, but you can mark it down, right? Spreads from China across Asia, eventually making its way to Europe. Medical knowledge from Greece and the Middle East spreading to Western Europe following the Crusades. And there are a lot of important locations for these transfers. For example, the Tang dynasty and the Abbasids, after fighting at the Battle of Talas, begin important cross-cultural exchanges where they will both learn mathematics and science from each other. The Abbasids will adopt paper making technologies from the Chinese after this beginning of this cross-cultural exchange. Of course, the Mongol Khanates we've already talked about, right, in their development of kind of a Eurasian empire, facilitate this transfer of goods. Trade or the Crusades allow for a cultural transfer from the Middle East to Western Europe. And Zheng He's voyages in the Indian Ocean maritime system allow for greater cross-cultural exchange between China and Southeast and South Asia. Zheng He, who famously brings back a giraffe to China as a gift for the emperor, it dies soon after. Beyond that, certainly there are other cross-cultural exchanges in this time period. I feel like I missed something in that last one. Maybe I didn't copy and paste it over from the chart I was making earlier. Oh yeah, I think I left off on that previous slide. You may want to throw it in there under spread of technology and science. Gunpowder and mathematics and astronomy. One of the things I think is super interesting about cultural exchanges between China and the Middle East is that when the Mongols take over in China, they bring Muslim bureaucrats to China to help run the government, but also they bring over scholars from the Middle East, especially from Baghdad, which was like the center of knowledge in the world at the time. And they even build observatories, astronomical observatories that are modeled off of those in the Middle East. So, that knowledge is spreading back and forth too. So we're starting to see advances in mathematics and astronomy at a much more rapid rate, because instead of just one country developing these in isolation and then eventually it's spreading, they're interacting with one another. So that's why I love talking about this topic. All right. Last thing with cross-cultural exchange for time period 3, we do see continued exchanges, some kind of more standard cultural exchanges. We see the development of diasporic communities, Muslim merchants from the Middle East moving and staying around the Indian Ocean maritime system and spreading Islam and their culture throughout the Indian Ocean. Chinese merchants, especially when the Mongols take over in China, merchants in southern China begin to spread throughout Southeast Asia and establish communities in those regions. In Central Asia, there are these groups called the Sogdians, who are traders, and they kind of spread out in different areas along the Silk Roads. If you ask me any other questions about them, that's about the extent of my knowledge on Sogdian merchants. Maybe I need to do a little bit more research. Jewish communities, especially in the Mediterranean, are very important, vitally important for the development of cartography technology, especially. But there are also Jewish communities, diasporic communities throughout the Indian Ocean maritime system, even along the Silk Roads, certainly in Eastern Europe, right? Especially if we kind of think about the massacre of Jewish communities by crusaders, right? We know they established communities in those regions. So culture will, as these communities spread along trade routes and move to centers of trade to form those connections, they will bring their culture with them. In some ways, this is helped by travelers between regions, right, that build interest in trade, whether it be Ibn Battuta, who you see in the bottom right of these pictures, Marco Polo in the top right, or Zhuan Zhang from China, who brought back with them like boxes of Buddhist texts. They spur interest in trade. There are other cultural effects, linguistic effects, the spread of Arabic, Turkic languages, Polynesian, Bantu languages, and certainly the spread of literary and artistic traditions. All of these things are spreading along with those goods, whether it be rice or silk or tea or coffee or gold or ivory or furs, whatever it might be. Other things are moving as well. And that's really what is important about trade in time period 3, at least causes and effects. So that's time period 3. And I know we're getting pretty far in, but I'm going to take a little break here to answer some questions in the chat. Give your fingers a breather or a rest if you are typing this stuff. I know it's a lot. This is a big topic. So don't, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed right now, again, I'll put the link to the slides in the chat at the end tonight. And you certainly will have opportunity to kind of go back through this information. I pulled it all from the key concepts. So, take it a little bit at a time, commit it to memory. All right. Let's see. First question about period 3. What do we know? What do we need to know about the origins of Islam? So, for this course, I can kind of give you the short version of it. Otherwise, because I could talk for days on this topic. It's one of my favorite subjects. Islam develops in the Arabian Peninsula, and it develops in a region that was known for trade, a region that connected the Indian Ocean to the Levant and into the Mediterranean Sea. It was between Egypt and Persia. And so this region had a lot of influences. People there were primarily tribal around the year 600. They were primarily polytheistic, although they would have been very familiar with many different religions from many different areas of the world, particularly Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, several pagan traditions, and probably a few other religions that aren't coming to my head right now. In the year 610, the prophet Muhammad, who was born about 570-ish, in the year 610, he begins receiving revelations from God, and they're given to him through the angel Gabriel. This is kind of the standard beliefs of Islam, and he is to share these words of God, which make up nowadays the Quran, the holy book of Islam. He is to share these words with the people of his region. And so he starts to do so, and some people convert to Islam, and some people start to follow him, and he kind of preaches against the polytheism, right? Islam is very much monotheistic, one God. So he starts to preach against polytheism in the region. He's run out of Mecca to a place called Medina. Mecca is where he lived. He was a member of the Quraysh clan. And in Medina, the religion really starts to take off, and they, not just as a religious and cultural aspect, but also the beginnings of a state, so to speak. And so these believers then go back, conquer Mecca, make it the center of the religion of Islam, basically do away with polytheism there. People begin to convert earnestly to Islam, and then they begin to spread that religion through conquest and through conversion and through trade, most of all, throughout the Arabian Peninsula, then into North Africa, eventually into Europe, and then also into Central Asia, and eventually into small parts of the Balkans. So that is really kind of the crux of the origins of Islam. Now, once the Prophet Muhammad dies, there are several caliphs or successors to Muhammad. It comes from the word khalifa, and they are to guide Islam forward. Ultimately, these first caliphs are known as the Rashidun Caliphate. After that caliphate, you have the Umayyad Caliphate, which expands Islam even further. That's followed by the Abbasid Caliphate. So these kind of large empires where Islam is the center, is kind of the binding factor of these empires under a caliph or a successor to the Prophet Muhammad. And for the most part, they were kind of like dynasties, like an Umayyad dynasty and an Abbasid dynasty. So that's kind of as short of an answer as I can make it. I wish I was better with concision in my speaking. All right, so let's let's move on. There are some things. What are the most important things we must know for periods 3 and 4? Trade. This is it. I really think this is probably the most significant thing in these time periods. There's certainly a lot. There's a lot of stuff we're not talking about here with the rise and fall of empires in time period 3. But trade, I think, across both time periods is significant. That's why I picked that tonight. All right. I hope we're ready for time period 4. I'm going to get a sip of my Coke Zero, which they're still not sponsoring me, but they should. I will accept their money to continue to drink a drink that I pay for. So what is different about time period 4? Well, let me just say this. We're going to see a lot of similarities. And in fact, I encourage you when you're done with your notes to go and use the highlighting function in Google Docs and just highlight things that you see that are similar or and maybe in a different color, things that are majorly different between the two time periods. First of all, time period 4, we can best describe trade in this time period, not just as transregional, but actually as global. This is the first time that the two hemispheres of the world are going to be connected in trade. This is the beginning of the process of globalization, a process that will be in progress from 1492, when Columbus arrives in the Americas, until today, and it is still ongoing. We're still finding our world becoming more and more closely connected. So trade becomes global in time period 4. Time period 4 begins in 1450, and it continues until the year 1750. So that's the 300 years we're going to focus on here. Notice that time period 4 is much shorter than time period 3. So changes are going to happen much more quickly than they had in the previous time period. We go usually into a little bit more depth in time period 4, kind of as we go. The dominant trade network in time period 4, although it is not technically formed at the start of the time period, it becomes the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is going to be the king by the end of this time period. But there are other dominant networks. The Indian Ocean maritime system is still very active. There's going to be more increasing trade there as well in this time period. There is some disruption of overland trade. The Silk Road will start to fall into disuse. But there still will be some trade over the Silk Roads. There still will be some trade over the Trans-Saharan networks. There still will be trade over in overland networks. But this is really where maritime trade takes off, and we start to leave overland trade behind. All right. So major participants, lots of people, I can't, but above all, Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, England, they are all, the Netherlands, they're going to be major participants in trade in this time period. They are really going to drive global trade with their involvement in the Indian Ocean, with the colonization of the Americas, and their involvement in the Atlantic. They're even going to spark trade in the Pacific as well, right? There is going to be a trans-Pacific trade, although perhaps not quite as significant as Sorry, I just got a message from another teacher at my school. I need to stop. I need to put my phone off. So I lost my train of thought there. Europe, really important here. But that does not mean there aren't other places involved. There still will be merchants and traders in Africa. There still will be merchants and traders in the Indian Ocean. China will still control trade. Remember, Europeans are a big part of trade in this time period, but oftentimes in time period 4, they have to play by other people's rules. Slave traders who arrived in West Africa didn't get to just do whatever they wanted. They had to abide by the local trade customs there in most cases. In India, they had to, in some places they do take control of trade on coastlines, but they don't make inroads into the interior of India. China really controls trade there. Heck, even Japan will kick out the Europeans in this time period when they start to get a little worried that they're going to have too much influence. So those are some things to consider in this time period. Europeans play a role. but a lot of other people are involved and play a major and have great control over this. So what are the causes of trade in this time period? I'm going to go through these real quick. God, glory, gold, right? I don't know what order. Maybe you can decide. Europeans are motivated by spreading their religion to the Americas. They're motivated by doing things first and better and getting rich, right? And depending on the country, perhaps the motivations are different, or perhaps maybe just depending on the person. There's certainly a desire for luxury goods, just like we had in time period 2, especially for goods from Asia, right? Portuguese exploration of the coast of Africa was initially for gold from Africa, and then the gold began getting to India. Columbus only sailed west because he thought it was a shorter route to India. He was wrong, but it worked out pretty well for Spain. Another thing, too, is to consider, Europeans could access Asian goods, but they had to access them through middlemen. And when we get around 1450, that middleman is the growing Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire. And while the Venetians were perfectly fine trading with them, Portugal and Spain, as Catholic countries who had fought wars for hundreds of years against Muslims, they didn't want to deal with them as middlemen. So they sought their own way to access those goods. So that's kind of a political conflict that leads to this. Certainly new technologies play a role. The astrolabe makes its way to Europe, or the modified astrolabe that's been improved makes its way to Europe and continues to be improved upon. New map-making technologies. Cartography becomes very advanced in Europe, especially with the influence of Jewish cartographers and the use of astrolabes and compasses to have more accurate measurements. New ships, right? Caravels, carracks, and flutes. These ships that are designed to sail in the rough waters of the Atlantic and carry large cargoes encourage trade. They incorporate designs from all around the world, stern rudders, lateen sails, right? These ships were meant for trade and meant to sail in many different types of seas. Along with cartography, greater knowledge of wind patterns and currents makes trade easier. And I already mentioned some of those new ship designs. Other causes of trade, right? Time period 3. Think about how time period 3 leads to time period 4. Those cross-cultural exchanges of time period 3 have Europeans especially thinking, well, what else is out there, right? What other exchanges are out there? Portugal is a leader in this navigation. They open up schools for navigation. There are new ways that merchants start to fund voyages, right? These are very costly. In Europe, we start to see people pooling their money together in joint stock companies to go out and trade around the world. And then it just simply becomes a positive feedback loop. Some people are doing it well. They're generating money. More people are going to trade. Trade begets trade. So then what are the effects? Well, in a nutshell, period 4 sees a even further intensification of trade, more stuff traded to more places on a global scale. Silver, especially silver mined in the Americas at places like Potosi in South America or in the mines of Mexico, it becomes a global currency, a currency that is accepted in Japan, the Philippines, China, India, East Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and of course the Americas. You see here pictured the peso de ocho, right? The pieces of 8 from Spain. And then, of course, this global trade, this time period, even though a lot of different groups are participating, Europe will come to dominate it. So that's by the end of the time period. So kind of keep that in mind in a nutshell anyways. There are a lot of environmental effects. We could do a whole video on the Columbian Exchange, but we're not going to. If you can find that in the Fiveable library, there was we had a review session that looked more closely at the Columbian Exchange. Environmental effects from the Columbian Exchange. 1, the spread of diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, along with disease vectors, disease-carrying animals like mosquitoes and rats, even pigs, heck, humans, right? We also see other environmental effects. American foods spreading to Afro-Eurasia, becoming staples of diets for people in Afro-Eurasia, foods like the potato, tomatoes. These foods lead to corn, beans, squash. They lead to more diverse diets and thus more nutritious diets. Goods moving or plants and animals moving from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, horses, pigs, cattle, that's going to completely change the landscape of the Americas, lead to deforestation, some cases soil depletion. We'll see kind of invasive species come over and change the landscape of the Americas. And then, of course, cash crops, which are brought to the Americas. So we see like massive deforestation with the development of plantations. So those are some of our environmental effects. Now, cross-cultural effects, right? There's still going to be these in time period 4 as well, right? We're going to see a continued spread of religion and even the reform of existing religions. So as Islam continues to spread in the Indian Ocean in this time period, I know we've been talking about Europe so much. It's a hard shift to talk about Islam. We see the development of the spread of Islam, especially through Sufism, which is kind of a branch or an offshoot of Islam. Now, if you don't know what that word means, highlight it, go and look it up later. We don't have time necessarily to talk about it right now. But it helps to spread Islam in Afro-Eurasia, Sub-Saharan Africa, especially India, even as far away as Southeast Asia. Christianity, of course, spreads as an effect of this exchange, especially to the Americas, even across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines, other areas of Afro-Eurasia. The spread of Christianity and the successes of the spread of Christianity in Japan is one of the reasons why the government of Japan, once it consolidates control, starts to kick out Christians from Japan because they don't want what happened in the Philippines to happen to Japan, which was European takeover, colonization by the Spanish. And as more of these religions come into contact and people interact with each other along trade routes, we're going to see syncretic religions develop. In India, blends of Hinduism and Islam, known as Sikhism. In the Americas, blends of African religions, native religions, and Christianity, like Santeria and Vodun. They become common in certain regions, especially in the Caribbean. And of course, there are going to be a lot of other effects. So this you can put under cross-cultural. You can create your own kind of, I think I have other changes mentioned, a category there. You might want to put this under period 4 for other changes. Though it is kind of cultural changes and a cultural effect of trade in time period 4. Anytime you get a lot of trade, you're going to make a lot of money. Anytime societies have lots of money and kind of money to be spent, we see funding for art, right? And so we're going to see the expansion of literacy, funding for art. What in England, it's funding for people like William Shakespeare. In Mughal India, it is funding for miniature paintings. In China, it's funding for performing arts and kabuki theater, right? We're seeing the expansion of literacy and books and education. There's going to be focuses on scientific innovation, right? When you're discovering new places and you're trading more and interacting with other cultures, it spurs the imagination. It spurs what else is possible. Europeans start to think, well, if we were wrong about, say, being, not having another continent on Earth, what else do we need? What else are we wrong about? And they start to look outside of themselves, and we see the scientific revolution develop, developments in astronomy and mathematics and a lot of other fields. Other things that we see, as European countries expand their trade rapidly, we're going to see competition over trade routes. We're going to see even conflicts develop. Piracy in the Caribbean. We're going to see when Europeans enter the Indian Ocean, they're going to have a rivalry with Omani merchants and Omani traders. So the Portuguese, when they arrive, first they have to, in establishing their trading post empire, they have to, they defeat Swahili cities to take control of trade there. They defeat cities on the Malabar coast of India to take control of trade there. So those are some effects too, right? Which might not be strictly cultural, but might be political in nature. Beyond that, kind of as a connection to these political changes, we have imperial expansion, and that we cannot ignore. as a result of this new global era of trade. Europeans will begin with the establishment of trading post empires in the Indian Ocean and colonization of North and South America. This will kind of be the first phase of imperial expansion in our world. In time period 5, we will see the second phase of that. The colonies of the Americas will largely become independent, and so Europeans will turn, especially when they're aided by the Industrial Revolution, to colonizing the regions of Asia and Africa in kind of a second wave of colonialism. So something to keep in mind, right? How trade can actually lead to the expansion of empires because they have the money to do so. They may have, with the scientific innovation that comes out of it, they may have the power to do so. And certainly they have the drive, they have the motivation to do so. More access to those goods and trade. Beyond that, with expansion, we see, especially in the Americas, for example, the enslavement of natives. We see the enslavement of Africans who are brought to the Americas to work in these plantation economies with coerced labor, predominantly African slaves. There, of course, was an era in time period 4 where Europeans used indentured servants, but that falls out of favor in favor of using African slaves. So these are some of our kind of other effects that we have to think about. Now, man, that's a lot in time periods 3 and 4. So let's think about what has changed across these time periods and what has stayed the same. This is kind of a comparison to what is different, what stays the same. Well, changes. During time period 3, kind of throughout time period 3, trade becomes much more intense. Through time period 4, trade continues to become more intense. That is a change. Like there's a kind of a constant upward trajectory, so to speak, of trade in this time period. I don't know whether I'm mirrored or not, but this should be going from, like, you can imagine year 600 here to 1750 here, right? We're going to see this upward trajectory of the amount of goods traded across the time periods. We see a change from trans-regional trade of time period 3 to global trade in time period 4. New networks develop. That's a big change, right? The Indian Ocean network isn't going anywhere. The Silk Road between these two time periods, in time period 4, it declines. It is not the same trade network that we saw in time period 3 where it reached its height. Instead, we get networks like the Atlantic and the Pacific networks for trade. And then even within time periods and between time periods, the participants change, right? Within time periods, there are different participants on the Silk Road throughout time period 3. But if we think about the big difference in participants from Unit 3 to Unit 4, the arrival of Europeans and the prominence of Europeans in trade is the biggest change between these time periods. Now, I'm going over kind of the change between these time periods. The likelihood that you get a question asking you to look at change across both of them at once is probably pretty low. 600 to 1750 is a massive time period. I would not expect to see that in an LEQ on your AP exam. You're likely going to get a question asked about changes and continuities just in trade in time period 3 or just in trade in time period 4. So I need to kind of let you know that. Now, what are things that stay the same? What are the things in time periods 3 and 4 that stay relatively consistent? First of all, along with goods, religions, diseases, cultures spread. I guess religion is part of culture. Science, technology, right? All of those things spread along with the items that are being traded, the goods being traded. Secondly, some networks do maintain their consistency across these time periods, right? The Indian Ocean is still a prominent trade network even to this day. It was king in time period 3. The Atlantic takes over in time period 4, but that doesn't mean trade disappears in the Indian Ocean. In fact, in time period 4, there's even more trade in the Indian Ocean. It just happens to be the Atlantic has a massive amount. And of course, cross-cultural exchanges when people trade, right? Language moving, food, art, science, tech, religion, which we've already talked about, but it's definitely worth talking about over and over again. These are continuities that we find across both of these. The continued spread of these aspects of our cultures. That's the chart. There's a lot of stuff. I know it. And I'm up for answering your question. I see we have like 14 questions down below. We're almost at an hour exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this for a second and share this link with you. Let me provide a link here. Give you the view aspect. I'm going to put this down in the chart, and you can stay for about 15 minutes of question answering, ask your questions. So feel free to post your questions. If you got them, there are the links to the slides for today. An hour on the dot. Look at me, guys. Look at me. How fantastic. But I'm going to answer some of these questions. So everybody take a look if you want to stick around at the question and answer section and upvote what you got. The top question is, can you share the slides? Yes, it's in the chat. Take a look. I just put them in there. Man, I'm so good at answering these questions. All right, next question. This is a good one. I think this kind of goes with how I was ending here. What are common prompts in SAQs, LEQs, or DBQs relating to trade and the rise of Islam, the effect of trade, what innovations led to better trade, cultural diffusion? Really great question. So I have to go from memory here. And SAQs will probably, at least in my recent memory, are where you might see questions asking about specific technologies related to trade. So you might have some kind of source that asks about trade in, say, time period 4, and it might be something about the Columbian exchange. And one of the parts of the SAQ might be to identify a technology that a technological development that made that trade possible, or explain how that type of trade became possible. And it might ask you to explain kind of how the technologies developed, right? Sometimes I see those in SAQs, in mock SAQs, and on past tests. The LEQ is really where in the past I've seen the most questions about trade in time periods, dealing with time periods 3 and 4. Last year, there was a question on the AP exam about the Columbian exchange, for example. That was one of the LEQ options. But in the past, there have been a lot of questions asking students to compare trade networks. So it might give you a few trade networks, and it might say, compare these, or analyze the changes in a set number of trade networks, in one or more trade networks in a set time period. It might be period 3 or period 4. That's what I would most expect to see. Now, could you get a DBQ on it? Certainly. I think, though, the DBQs have been skewing more toward the later time periods lately. The DBQ probably would deal with some specific aspect of trade. For example, attitudes toward trade, maybe something like that. And it might be documents, looking at attitudes toward trade from many different perspectives across Afro-Eurasia, something like that. The DBQ, you'll have the documents to attack the question. But overall, I'd expect to see an LEQ. And if you take a look back at the College Board materials and you go through past years, you're likely to see some examples of LEQs asking about trade networks. Off the top of my head, I feel like there might have been one in 2015. I think that was the first year I taught the class. I think that year there was an LEQ specifically about comparing trade routes, if you're looking for one to practice. All right, good question. Good question. Now, this is something that I briefly mentioned, but it's a good thing to talk about just in terms of kind considering the gosh, losing my train of thought. Considering like what is some important ideas and concepts out of periods 3 and 4, especially in period 3, we see the development of Neo-Confucianism. All right, so the question here is, can you do a quick rundown of Neo-Confucianism versus Confucianism? And overall, Neo-Confucianism simply means like new Confucianism. And it develops, it's a renewed emphasis on Confucian values that comes about in China during the later Tang Dynasty in response to the elevation of Buddhism in Chinese culture. So, for example, you may have read about Empress Wu, who was the only real female empress of China that we have in this course. And she kind of elevates Buddhism above that of Taoism, a traditional Chinese religion, in thinking about in total importance in China. And so Buddhism starts to take on a greater and greater role, but there's a backlash against Buddhism because Buddhism is a foreign religion. It was developed in India and it moved into China. And Buddhist monasteries hold a lot of money. In fact, they served as like banks and basically welfare, places to provide welfare for the local population. And people could go into the Buddhist monastery and they would not have to serve in the Chinese military. Buddhist monasteries did not have to pay taxes to the Chinese state. And so people started seeing Buddhism as a threat to China. And so there is a backlash against Buddhism and a repression of Buddhism. In fact, there's like destruction of monasteries across the Chinese countryside. And in its place, there is a renewed emphasis on the traditions of China. And the greatest among those traditions is Confucianism. This renewed emphasis on Confucianism becomes known as Neo-Confucianism. It is certainly very much patriarchal. And this Neo-Confucianism, a renewed emphasis on Confucianism, which involved, of course, other kind of influences, some Buddhist, some Taoist, whatever, but predominantly kind of the teachings of Confucius, it will spread along with other Chinese influences to places like Korea and Japan and Southeast Asia. In some places, they welcome it wholeheartedly. Some it's brought and kind of enforced, like in Korea. Japan welcomes it. They kind of bring it in. They want to modernize their state in time period 3 to become more like China. In some ways it's successful. In some ways it's not. You can look up the Taika reforms, Taika reforms, if you want to know more about that. And in some places like Vietnam, they're not too happy with these kind of Neo-Confucian Chinese beliefs because they had a strong history of powerful women in their culture. And so they kind of pushed back against it. But that's the main thing, right? We see is this Neo-Confucianism, which really takes the predominant teachings of Confucianism and mixes it with other traditional Chinese beliefs. And it is a kind of new guiding philosophy for China that at its base is Chinese, not foreign like Buddhism. All right, great question. Can I elaborate on the difference between trans-regional and regional? Yes. So now let me say this. When I'm going to kind of elaborate on this difference, it is really, I would say, your definition could change based on your perspective of this. But generally, when we're thinking about regional trade, we're thinking about trade within kind of a local region. And you can think of like the AP regions, like trade within South Asia, trade within East Asia, trade within Europe, trade within North Africa, trade within the Middle East. And trans-regional is the trade that goes between those. Trans-regional trade had been occurring for a long time before time period 3. It occurred in even as far back as time period 1, there was some trans-regional trade, but very little, like not very much at all. In time period 2, with the rise of the Romans and the Chinese and the development of the Silk Roads and the beginning of kind of the growth of Indian Ocean maritime system, we see a little bit more trans-regional trade. Most people are trading locally, right? They're trading within kind of their closest regions. But they're starting to get a taste for those goods from outside. Time period 3, yes, obviously most trade is going to be rather local and regional, but we're seeing an intensification of trans-regional trade. It's occurring a lot more. It's much more common, especially in the Indian Ocean and along the Silk Roads. It's very regular. It is not unusual to find goods from a foreign region in your region anymore, especially if you're kind of wealthier and can afford those things. So think about it in terms of, how the advanced placement course defines the different regions of AP World History, right? If it's going between two of those regions, we'd consider it to be trans-regional. That has occurred for a long time. It occurred before time period 3. It occurred after time period 3, but it intensifies. Period 3 is really where we see a real intensification of it. Now, in time period 4, we call it global because we see trade occurring still. It's still trans-regionally, but it actually involves the entire globe, not just Afro-Eurasia. All right, let's see. Next question. Are stimulus multiple choice harder or easier than mock exam stimulus multiple choice? Some people say it's easier, some say it's harder. I'm guessing you mean, are the stimulus multiple choice on the AP exam easier or harder than mock exams that say you might get in a review book? So that's the way I'm going to take this question. And so hopefully I'm understanding you right, Karen. It's tough to say. I would say they tend to be, it depends on your review book. I'd say they tend to be easier a lot of the time. I know my students, when I give them my AP exam or my chapter exams, my questions are harder than the AP exam. And there's a reason for that. I'm asking 40 questions probably just on a single time period, right? So if I'm asking 40 questions on time period 3 or 50 questions on time period 3, I'm going to go into a lot more detail. I'm going to want to make sure they can make a lot more detailed connections than if I'm asking 55 questions across all 6 time periods. So you're likely going to see big trends in your multiple choice questions. I can't guarantee that's going to be the what happens. It's a crapshoot. We do our very best to try to prepare you. I try to do the best to prepare my students to be ready for anything. Almost every year, my students come back and they say, we were prepared, right? I do with them what I'm doing with you here. They come back and they say, we were prepared. Nothing surprised me. Whether the questions are hard or easy, as long as you're not surprised by them. One way to make sure that you're prepared is by practicing those multiple choice questions. And if you have a review book, my advice is not necessarily to sit down and do all 55 practice questions. You want to do that at least once when you're reviewing. But a lot of these review books, and I don't want to what reviews are out there. I don't want to endorse one over another. You don't have to do them 55 questions at a time to get a lot out of it. Take 10 at a time or 15 at a time and just practice those. Time yourself as you go through 15 or 12 of them. And then spend some time looking at the explanations of those questions. If your review book that you have some practice questions in do not have explanations of the questions, probably not worth your time, because just having an answer may not be enough. You need to know why the answer is what it is. So break it down into smaller portions, and that continued practice and understanding why the correct answer is what it is will help you out. Another thing that'll help, key concepts. Knowing the key concepts, these questions are built around the key concepts. Oftentimes, and this isn't for everyone, but oftentimes the answers on these stimulus-based multiple choice questions are a phrasing that comes from the key concepts. And they give you 2 sources, or they give you a source or an image, and they say, what trend does this represent, or most impacted the scene shown in this image, or whatever it might be. And then they list 4 trends. And one of those is just a restatement of what's in the key concepts. So if you can, if you read through those, I think the Fiveable, like cram packet, I forget what it's called, maybe Amanda or somebody could type it in here, or Dylan, if you remember. I know that you and Dylan and some of our interns were working on that packet. Those have the key concepts in them. You can find them online. Just search AP World History Key Concepts. Reading through those is a great way to study, I think. I have videos on my YouTube channel on the key concepts and review packets that go through every single one of them. So knowing them will help. Are they harder or easier? Short answer is it's a crapshoot. However, they curb the test, so that helps. All right. Next question. Can you explain the Bantu migrations and their effects a little bit more? Yes. So the Bantu migrations occur in Africa, basically from sub-Saharan Africa, maybe the region kind of West Africa, just below the Sahara Desert. People there developed iron making technology. They developed agriculture. And over time, due to many things, environmental pressures, population pressures, those people start to migrate out of West Africa throughout sub-Saharan Africa into Central and East Africa and Southern Africa. And this happens over thousands of years. It's covered in this time period. But with them, they bring their knowledge of agriculture. They bring with them their iron making technologies, spreading the know-how how to make iron, and they bring with them their language and their culture. And so we see kind of these Bantu languages, which eventually develop, especially in East Africa. They combine with Arabic, and they combine with other Indian Ocean languages to form Swahili. One of the reasons why these Bantu peoples can eventually kind of migrate to certain areas, certainly in the interior of Africa, is the development of new crops that can grow there. The introduction of bananas helps with that too. The introduction of bananas to Africa, which then become pretty easily cultivated in that region. So the Bantu migrations are oftentimes compared to the Polynesian migrations, because the Polynesian migrations also spread knowledge of agriculture, along with the movement of animals and technologies, sailing technologies especially. And they also carry with them some environmental effects, right? The Polynesian migrations, deforestation of certain islands. You can think about Easter Island there. They do have environmental effects, and they also spread culture and language along with them. All right, good question. I'm a little over on time. I'll take a couple more. What impact does Islam have on the Columbian exchange is this question. Now, I would say the impact of Islam on the Columbian exchange is indirect. It's the Columbian exchange probably would have occurred even without necessarily, perhaps maybe just like the existence of Islam. But the Islamic world, the world of the Middle East in time period 3, was one that valued knowledge. It valued science, technology, math, still does. And in that region of the world, there is kind of a synthesis of knowledge from all 4 corners of the globe, right? Old Greco-Roman knowledge and, the knowledges of the old world of Alexandria, Egypt, and then knowledge from South Asia, knowledge from China. It kind of comes together in the Middle East. And from there, it spreads to Europe, especially to the Iberian Peninsula, places like Portugal and Spain. Now, Portugal and Spain, they got a tough relationship. They don't really get along with Muslims. And that's because of the history of Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, and they're fighting with Christians. And so, they take their knowledge from them. They certainly are impacted culturally by Islam. But ultimately, Christian armies went out, and Portugal and Spain are set up as very devoutly Catholic Christian nations. And they don't really want to have anything to do with Muslim middlemen. And so the existence of a growing Ottoman, growing in power at this time, in around 1450 to 1500, growing in power Ottoman Empire, means that Spain and Portugal, if they want access to the goods that you would typically have to go through the Muslim world, which was the Middle East, predominantly North Africa, to get, whether it was gold from sub-Saharan Africa, or ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, or slaves from sub-Saharan Africa, or gems from India, or silk from China, whatever it is, spices from India. That's something I didn't mention at all today. I don't know what I was thinking. Spices from India. Then they would have to go through this Muslim group, and they didn't want to. So in a way, indirectly, the desire to not do business with the Muslims is what is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that spurred the Portuguese and Spanish to find other ways to access those goods, ultimately resulting in Columbus sailing for Spain, landing in the Americas. And I think that's, one impact, albeit indirect. All right, last question here. What are the main ideas we should know about languages in period 3? Know that languages, like religions, like any other cultural aspect, spread along trade routes. And so in time period 3, that might be the spread of Arabic, the spread of the Bantu language family, the spread of the Polynesian language family. Heck, it's even going back to time period 2 and time period 3, the spread of Latin-based languages. In time period 4, it's the spread of Spanish and English and French to the New World, along with trade, right? Most people in Central Mesoamerica, Central America, South America, the world we call Latin America, they speak Spanish or Portuguese. And that is a result of trade and interaction in time period 4 and after. All right, IOMS, Indian Ocean Maritime System. Sorry if I didn't answer that. Oh, somebody answered that for you. All right, that is our review for tonight. We covered so much information. Hopefully it was worthwhile for you. I really, really hope that you enjoyed it. Take a look at those slides if you need to go back and take a look at anything. All the information in the slides I brought together by looking at the key concepts for time periods 3 and 4, maybe sprinkled in a little bit of my own knowledge, but for the most part from the key concepts. So if there's anything you don't know from there, look it up. You'll need to know it. Thanks so much. Somebody's like, please answer my question. Somehow I missed it. Okay. Oh, I see. Can you go over the main facts we need to know for each Chinese dynasty? Oh, that would be a really great topic that I can cover. Maybe I need to do that in a special session. I can send you, Nicole, to a certain place where you can do that. If you go to Freemanpedia, he has one-pagers. He has a section on his website, Freemanpedia, called something along the lines of In Review. And under that are some key concepts, and one-page key concepts. And some of those have really, really great summaries of those Chinese dynasties. Maybe not all together in one of the one-pagers, but for example, in time period 2, it'll summarize the Qin and the Han dynasties. In time period 3, it'll summarize the Sui, the Tang, the Yuan, and the Ming dynasties, and their accomplishments. But that is certainly something that I will take under advisement for a future review. We just don't have time for it at this point. So I'm so sorry that I can't answer that one fully right now, but I will mark it down as a possible review topic. It's also something that I may tackle in my own YouTube channel. That might be something I could do as well. So I'm sorry I didn't get all the way to that. That's pretty much it. Some people are asking about my YouTube channel. There it is, RTHS Patrick Lassiter. This has been a review of trade in periods 3 and 4. Thank you for sticking with me, even though we went a little long today, but you had some great questions that I wanted to answer. Y'all have a wonderful night. See you next time. Looking forward to it. I'll be back next week. And